Section number 5 of Movies and Hollywood Short Story Collection, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Candace Stellick, Dallas, Texas. Mrs. Bathurst, Part 2, by Rudyard Kipling, 1904. The giant heaved inside his uniform and rolled his eyes at the car roof. Said Pyecroft suddenly, "How many women have you been intimate with all over the world, Pritch?" Pritchard blushed plum color to the short hairs of his 17-inch neck. "'Undreds," said Pyecroft. "So have I." "How many of 'em can you remember in your own mind, settin' aside the first, and perhaps the last, and one more?" "Few. Wonderful few. Now I tax myself," said Sergeant Pritchard, relievedly. "And how many times might have you been at Auckland?" "One, two," he began. "Why, I can't make it more than 3 times in 10 years. But I can remember every time that I ever saw Mrs. B." "So can I. And I've only been to Auckland twice. How she stood, and what she was sayin', and what she looked like, that's the secret. 'Tisn't beauty, so to speak, nor good talk necessarily. It's just it. Some women'll stay in a man's memory if they once walk down a street, but most of 'em you can live with a month on end, and next commission you'd be put to it to certify whether they talked in their sleep or not, as one might say." "Ah," said Hooper, "that's more the idea. I've known just 2 women of that nature." "And it was no fault of theirs?" asked Pritchard. "None whatever. I know that." "And if a man gets struck with that kind o' woman, Mrs. Hooper," Pritchard went on, "he goes crazy, or just saves himself," was the slow answer. "You've hit it," said the sergeant. "You've seen and known something in the course of your life, Mr. Hooper. I'm looking at you." He set down his bottle. "And how often had Vickery seen her?" I asked. "That's the dark and bloody mystery," Pyecroft answered. "I'd never come across him till I come out in the Hierophant just now, and there wasn't any one in the ship who knew much about him. You see, he was what you call a superior man. He spoke to me once or twice about Auckland and Mrs. B. on the voyage out. I called that to mind subsequently. There must have been a good deal between 'em, to my way o' thinkin'. Mind you, I'm only giving you my resume of it all, because all I know is second hand, so to speak, or rather, should I say more than second hand." "How?" said Hooper peremptorily. "You must have seen it or heard it." "Yes," said Pyecroft. "I used to think seein' and hearin' was the only regulation aids to ascertainin' facts, but as we get older we get more accommodatin'. The cylinders work easier, I suppose." "Were you in Cape Town last December when Phyllis's circus came?" "No, up country," said Hooper, a little nettled at the change of venue. "I asked because they had a new turn of a scientific nature called 'Home and Friends for a Tickie.'" "Oh, you mean the cinematograph. The pictures of prize fights and steamers. I've seen 'em up country. Biograph or cinematograph was what I was alludin' to. London Bridge, with the omnibuses, a troop ship goin' to the war, Marines on parade in Portsmouth, and the Plymouth Express arrivin' at Paddington." "Seen 'em all," said Hooper impatiently. "We Hierophants came in just before Christmas week, and leave was easy. I think a man gets fed up with Cape Town quicker than anywhere else on the station. Why, even Durban's more like nature." "We was there for Christmas," Pritchard put in. "Not bein' a devotee of Indian Paris, as our doctor said to the Pusser, I can't exactly say. Phyllis's was good enough for musketry practice at Mozambique. I couldn't get off the first 2 or 3 nights on account of what you might call an imbroglio with our torpedo lieutenant in the submerged flat, where some pride of the West Country had sugared up a gyroscope, but I remember Vickery went ashore with our carpenter Rigdon. Old Crocus we called him. As a general rule Crocus never left his ship unless until he was ousted out with a winch. But when he went, he would return noddin' like a fly gemmed with dew. We smothered him down below that night, but the things he said about Vickery as his fittin' playmate for a warrant officer of his cubic capacity, before we got him quiet, was what I should call pointed. "I've been with Crocus in the Redoubtable," said the sergeant. "He's a character if there is one. Next night I went to Cape Town with Dawson and Pratt, but just at the door of the circus I came across Vickery. 'Oh,' he says, 'you're the man I'm looking for. Come and sit next me. This way to the shillin' places.' I went astern at once, protestin' because ticky seats better suited my so-called finances. 'Come on,' says Vickery, 'I'm payin'.' Naturally, I abandoned Pratt and Dawson in anticipation of drinks to match the seats. 'No,' he says. When this was inted, 'Not now. Not now. As many as you please afterwards, but I want you sober for the occasion.' I caught his face under a lamp just then, and the appearance of it quite cured me of my thirsts. Don't mistake, it didn't frighten me. It made me anxious. I can't tell you what it was like, but that was the effect which it had on me. If you want to know, it reminded me of those things in bottles, those herbalistic shops at Plymouth, preserved in spirits of wine, white and crumply things previous to birth, as you might say." "You've a bestial mind, Pye," said the sergeant, relighting his pipe. "Perhaps. We were in the front row, and Home and Friends came on early. Vickery touched me on the knee when the number went up. 'If you see anything that strikes you,' he says, 'drop me a hint.' Then he went on clicking. We saw London Bridge, and so forth and so on, and it was most interestin'. I'd never seen it before. You 'eard a little dynamo like buzzin', but the pictures were the real thing, alive and movin'." "I've seen 'em," said Hooper. "Of course they are taken from the very thing itself, you see. Then the Western Mail came in to Paddington on the big magic lantern sheet. First we saw the platform emptying and the porter standing by. Then the engine come in, head on, and the women in the front row jumped, she had it so straight. Then the doors opened and the passengers came out like the porters got the luggage, just like life. Only when anyone came down too far towards us that was watchin', they walked right out the picture, so to speak. I was highly interested, I can tell you. So were all of us. I watched an old man with a rug, who'd and dropped a book and was trying to pick it up, when quite slowly from behind two porters, carrying a little reticula and looking from side to side, comes out Mrs. Bathurst. There was no mistaking the walk in 100,000. She came forward, right forward. She looked out straight at us, with that blindish look which Pritch alluded to. She walked on and on till she melted out of the picture, like a shadow jumping over a candle, and she went out, and I heard Dawson in the ticky seats behind sing out, 'Christ, there's Mrs. B.'" Hooper swallowed his spittle and leaned forward intently. Vickery touched me on the knee again. He was clicking his 4 false teeth, with his jaw down like an enteric at the last kick. "Are you sure?" says he. "Sure," I says. "Didn't you hear Dawson give tongue? Why, it's the woman herself." "I was sure before," he says, "but I brought you to make sure. Will you come again with me tomorrow?" "Willingly," I says. "It's like meetin' old friends." "Yes," he says, opening his watch, "very like. It will be 24 hours less 4 minutes before I see her again. Come and have a drink," he says. "It may amuse you, but it's no sort of earthly use to me." He went out shaking his head and stumbling over people's feet as if he was drunk already. I anticipated a swift drink and a speedy return, because I wanted to see the performing elephants. Instead of which, Vickery began to navigate the town at the rate of knots, looking in at a bar every 3 minutes, approximate Greenwich time. I'm not a drinking man, though there are those present, he cocked his unforgettable eye at me, who may have seen more or less imbued with the fragrant spirit. None the less, when I drink, I like to do it at anchor and not at an average speed of 18 knots on the measured mile. There's a tank, as you might say, at the back of that big hotel up the hill. What do they call it?" "The Motelno Reservoir," I suggested, and Hooper nodded. "That was his limit o' drift. He walked there, and we come down through the gardens. There was a south-easter blowin', and we finished up by the docks. Then we bore up the road to Salt River, and wherever there was a pub Vickery put in sweatin'. He didn't look at what he drunk. He didn't look at the change. He walked and he drunk and he perspired in the rivers. I understood why old Crocus come back in the condition he did." "What do you think?" said Hooper, fingering his waistcoat pocket. "Several things," said Pyecroft. "To tell you the truth, I aren't quite done thinking about it yet. Mad? The man was a dumb lunatic. Must have been for months, years perhaps. I know something of maniacs, as every man in the service must. I've been shipmates with a mad skipper, and a lunatic number one, but never both together, I thank 'Eaven. I could give you the names of 3 captains now who ought be in an asylum, but you don't find me interferin' with the mentally afflicted till they begin to lay out about 'em with rammers and winch handles. Only once I crept up a little too into the wind towards Master Vickery. 'I wonder what she's doin' in England,' I says. 'Don't it seem to you she's lookin' for somebody?' That was in the gardens again, with the south-easter blowin', as we were makin' our desperate round. 'She's lookin' for me,' he says, stoppin' dead and under a lamp and clickin', when he wasn't drinkin', in which case all his teeth clicked on the glass. He was clickin' his 4 false teeth like a Marconi ticker. 'Yes, lookin' for me,' he said, and he went on very softly, as you might say affectionately. 'But,' he went on, 'in the future, Mr. Pyecroft, I should take it kindly of you if you'd confide your remarks to the drink set before you. Otherwise,' he says, 'with the best will in the world towards you, I may find myself guilty of murder. Do you understand?' he says. 'Perfectly,' I says. 'But would it at all soothe you to know that in such a case the chances of you being killed are precisely equivalent to the chances of me being outed?' 'Why, no,' he says. 'I'm almost afraid that you'd be a temptation.' Then I said, 'We was right under the lamp by that arch at the end of the gardens where the trans came around. Assumin' murder was done, or attempted murder, I put it to you that you would still be left so badly crippled, as one might say, that your subsequent capture by the police, to whom you'd have to explain, would be largely inevitable.' 'That's better,' he says, passing his hands over his forehead. 'That's much better, 'cause,' he says, 'do you know, as I am now, Pye, I'm not sure if I could explain anything much.' Those were the only particular words I 'ad with him in our walks as I remember." "What walks?" said Hooper. "Oh, my soul, what walks?" "They were chronic," said Pyecroft gravely. "But I didn't anticipate any danger till the circus left. Then I anticipated that, being deprived of his stimulant, he might react on me, so to say, with a hatchet. Consequently, after the final performance and the ensuing wet walk, I kept myself aloof from my superior officer on board in the execution of his duty, as you might put it. Consequently, I was interested whether the sentry informs me, while I was passing on my lawful occasions, that Click had asked to see the captain. As a general rule, warrant officers don't dissipate much of the owner's time, but Click put in an hour or more behind that door. My duties kept me within eyeshot of it. Vickery came out first, and he actually nodded at me and smiled. This knocked me out of the boat, because, having seen his face for 5 consecutive nights, I didn't anticipate any change there more of a considerin' hell, so to speak. The owner emerged later. His face didn't read off at all, so I fell back on his cox, who'd have been 8 years with him and knew him better than boat signals. Lamson, that was the cox's name, crossed his bows once or twice at low speeds and dropped down to me visibly concerned. He shipped his court-martial face. Says Lamson, 'Someone's goin' to be hung.' I've never seen that look once before, but when they chucked the gun sights overboard in the Fantastic, throwing gun sights overboard, Mr. Hooper, is the equivalent of mutiny in these degenerate days. It's done to attract the notice of the authorities in the Western Morning News, generally by a stoker. Naturally, word went around the lower deck, and we had a private overhaul of our little consciences. But barring a shirt, which a second-class stoker said had walked into his bag from the Marines flat by itself, nothing vital transpired. The owner went about flying the signal for attend public execution, so to say, but there was no corpse at the yardarm. He lunched on the beach, and he returned with his regulation harbor routine face about 3 p.m. Thus, Lamson lost prestige for raising false arms. The only person who might have connected to the epicycloidal gears correctly was one Pycroft, when he was told that Mr. Vickery would go up country that same evening to take over certain naval ammunition left after the war in Bloemfontein Fort. No details was ordered to accompany Master Vickery. He was told off first person singular, as a unit, by himself. The Marine whistled penetratingly. "That's what I thought," said Pycroft. "I went ashore with him in the cutter and he asked me to walk through the station. He was clicking audibly, but otherwise seemed happyish. 'You might like to know,' he says, stopping just opposite of the Admiral's front gate, 'that Phyllis's Circus will be performing at Worcester tomorrow night. So I shall see her yet once again. You've been very patient with me,' he says. 'Look here, Vickery,' I said, 'this thing's come to be just as much as I can stand. Consume your own smoke. I don't want to know any more.' 'You,' he said, 'what have you got to complain of? You've only had to watch. I'm it,' he says. 'But that's neither here nor there,' he says. 'I've one thing to say before shaking hands. Remember,' he says, 'we were just by the Admiral's garden gate. Then remember that I am not a murderer, because my lawful wife died in childbed 6 weeks after I came out. That's much at least I am clear of,' he says. 'Then what have you done that signifies?' I said. 'What's the rest of it?' 'The rest,' he says, 'is silence.' And he shook hands and went clicking into Simon's Town station." "Did he stop to see Mrs. Bathurst at Worcester?" I asked. "It's not known. He reported at Bloemfontein, saw the ammunition into trucks, and then disappeared. Went out deserted, if you care to put it so, with 18 months of his pension, and if what he said about his wife was true, he was a free man, as he stood. How do you read it off?" "Poor devil," said Hooper, "to see her that way every night. I wonder what it was." "I've made my 'ead ache in that direction many a long night. But I'll swear Mrs. B. had no 'and in it," said the sergeant, unshaken. "No, whatever the wrong or deceit was, he did it, I'm sure of that. And I'd look at his face for 5 consecutive nights. And I'm not so fond of navigating about Cape Town with a southeaster blowing these days. I can hear those teeth click, so to say." "Ah, those teeth," said Hooper, and his hand went to his waistcoat pocket once more. "Permanent things, false teeth are. You read about 'em in all the murder trials." "What do you suppose the captain knew, or did?" I asked. "I never turned my searchlight that way," Pycroft answered unblushingly. We all reflected together and drummed on empty beer bottles as the picnic party, sunburned, wet, sandy, unpassed our door singing "The Honeysuckle and the Bee." "Pretty girl underneath that capshe," said Pycroft. "They never circulated his description?" said Pritchard. "I was asking you before these gentlemen came," said Hooper to me, "whether you knew Wankies or the way to the Zambesi, beyond Buluwayo?" "Would he pass me there, trying to get to that lake, what's its name?" said Pritchard. Hooper shook his head and went on. "There's a curious bit of line there, you see. It runs through solid teak forest, a sort of mahogany really, 72 miles without a curve. I've had a train derailed there 23 times in 40 miles. I was up there a month ago, relieving a sick inspector, you see. He told me to look out for a couple of tramps in the teak." "Two?" Pycroft said. "I don't envy that other man if we get heaps of tramps up there since the war. The inspector told me I'd find them at McBinway siding waiting to go north. He'd given 'em some grub and quinine, you see. I went up on a construction train. I looked out for 'em. I saw them miles ahead along the straight, waiting in the teak. One of 'em was standin' up by the dead end of the siding, and the other was squattin' down lookin' up at 'em, you see." "What did you do for him?" said Pritchard. "There wasn't much I could do, except bury 'em. There'd been a bit of a thunderstorm in the teak, you see, and they were both stone dead and as black as charcoal. That's what they really were, you see, charcoal. They fell to bits when we tried to shift 'em. The man who was standin' up had the false teeth. I saw him shinin' against the black. Fell to bits he did, too, like a mate squattin' down and watchin' him, both of 'em, all wet in the rain. Both burned to charcoal, you see. And that's what made me ask about the marks just now. The false toother was tattooed on the arms and chest. A crown and foul anchor, with M.V. above." "I've seen that," said Pyecroft quickly. "It was so." "But if he was all charcoal like," said Pritchard, shuddering. You know how writing shows up white on a burned letter? Well, it was like that, you see. We buried him in the teak, and I kept but he was afraid of you two gentlemen, you see." Mr. Hooper brought his hand away from his waistcoat pocket, empty. Pritchard covered his face with his hands for a moment, like a child shutting out an ugliness. "And to think of her at Hauraki," he murmured, "with e'er a ribbon on my bier. Ada," she said to her niece, "oh, my God!" On a summer afternoon, when the honeysuckle blooms, and all nature seems at rest, underneath the bower, 'mid the perfume of the flower, sat a maiden with the one she loves the best, sang the picnic party waiting for their train at Glengariff. "Well, I don't know how you feel about it," said Pyecroft, "but 'avin' seen his face for 5 consecutive nights on end, I'm inclined to finish what's left of the beer and thank God he's dead." End of Section 5 of Movies and Hollywood Short Story Collection, Mrs. Bathurst, Part 2, by Rudyard Kipling, 1904. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Candace Stellick, Dallas, Texas.